Greetings, brothers, brothers and sisters. I want to thank, first of all, the presiding bishop, Bishop Nyaka, for the invitation for this evening event. Thank you, Bishop, that I'm able now to share with you and the others my reflections on the Lutheran World Federation and the role of ELCSA within the LWF and within the stage of the global Lutheran family. I greet you also and the leadership, and I want to thank also those who have assisted in the arrangements of these logistics, the computers and other things that are so advanced that I had to take some minutes a day ago to get orientation regarding the technical facilities. I want to greet all those who are far and near. Some of you understand are abroad. As Bishop Nyaka has indicated already, he is in Luanda, Angola. My warm greetings and congratulations for the launching of 50 years anniversary of ELCSA. ELCSA is indeed a regional church. That history of regionality is rooted in what has gone on before since many years ago. In the 19th century, late 19th century, and very early 20th century. I greet you also, brothers and sisters, aware that we are commemorating within the context of this celebration of 50 years, we are commemorating the 1,700 years of the Nicene Creed. A creed that we confess in Sunday services and on other occasions, an ecumenical confession belonging to the church, originated also within the context of the issues originating from within the church in North Africa. And today, the 50 years of ELCSA is celebrated within the context of the Nicene Creed. What a coincidence. In a way, we are fulfilling that which is also part of the Augustana, Confessio Augustana. But let me go to the subject matter that you've invited me to reflect on. On account of time, I will have to be very telegraphic, and so I hope you don't mind. And also the subject itself will require a number of hours. But let me say the Lutheran World Federation is one of the most influential global instrument of churches of the Lutheran tradition. It is a Christian communion uniting over 99 churches, 150 churches in 99 countries, let me say. Together, we are 77 million people around the world. It was established in the year 1947 in Lund, Sweden, on July 1947. By 47 Lutheran churches, mainly from Europe and North America. This happened immediately after the Second World War. Present at that time as delegates were mainly, as I said, Europeans and Americans, but there were few people who came from the Southern Hemisphere. China had sent delegates from mainland China, and a few also delegates came from India. Besides that, that was all the Southern Hemisphere was represented directly. But there were representatives from the churches in Africa at that time, but most of them and all of them were missionaries who originate from Europe. When the LWF was launched, it was launched as a consequence of the Second World War, as I said. The LWF emerged, therefore, as both a spiritual and a practical response to the devastation, to the displacement, to the suffering experience in Europe. It was also a theological endeavor, affirming the unity of Lutheran churches worldwide by means of mutual recognition, shared confessions, and common service. By that time of 1947, Lutheran churches have been separated for more than 400 years. They lived in isolation, and you can imagine when they arrived as delegates from various countries that were at war with each other. So it is, in a way, possible to say when they gathered and worked together, worshiped together, it was indeed a miracle. For these nations and these delegates came from countries at war with each other, as I've said. However, there was some initiative that had been taken into account a few years ago. The first gathering of Lutherans, again, mainly individuals, not necessarily people who went to the gathering in Eisenach in the year 1923. They gathered as individuals, as a representative of nobody, but it was a gathering that was mainly Americans, North Americans, and European churches, or represented individuals from European churches. At that time, they agreed to form something called the structure called the Lutheran World Convention. It was a convention. The Americans provided an interpretation of what is a convention? What does that mean? It was a gathering of people that they were not taking decisions that will impact each other, but they took decisions which could not be carried forward to the next convention. So that's what the convention was understood to be at that time. There were several conventions from the year 1923 to the year 1947. In between, it was decided to create a more coordinative organization internationally. Hence, the Lutheran World Federation met in Sweden, and it was formed and launched there. However, the Evangelical Lutheran Church, if it's seen in that context, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Southern Africa, ELCSA, has been a significant member of the global body only from 1976, after the formation in 1975. And that, nonetheless, reminds us that ELCSA is deeply rooted, as I said earlier, in the 19th and the 20th century, in missionary work, that outreach. Yes, it was missionary work that brought together people from Europe and from Southern Africa. In my presentation, I want to remind myself and remind all of you that ELCSA played a critical role in the life and the work of the Lutheran World Federation. Because of time and space, I will reflect in a telegraphic style on the governance, on theology, mission, followed by an analysis of ELCSA's engagement and role in the LWF and on the broader Lutheran family of churches. Let me look at the LWF once more. At the level of formation and founding in 1947, the Lutheran churches stated earlier, the intention was to provide the following three critical opportunities: a platform for the theological unity among the Lutheran churches. It was very important to understand that the LWF was going to be a platform of theological unity within the LWF member churches. Secondly, as a coordination for relief and development following the devastation of the impact of World War II. Thirdly, a common witness to the gospel through advocacy, service, and ecumenical dialogue. From its inception, the LWF emphasized that life in communion is not just organizational matter, but a confessional participation in God's mission. It drew from the Augustana Confession and other Lutheran symbols, affirming the centrality of justification by faith, through justification by grace through faith, the centrality of word and sacrament, and the centrality of the priesthood of all believers. It was important to have that. It was very important at that time that this emphasis be given. I have to move a few things here on my screen. Now, with respect to the governance and leadership, the LWF is governed through several key bodies. The Assembly, as the highest decision-making body, convened every 6 years. It sets policy, direction, and the election of the president and the election of council members. Now, first of all, I need to indicate that the president, who heads as the spiritual head of the LWF, Lutherans, when they gathered in Lund, they were hesitating what this organization they are forming would one day become. What they wanted to avoid most of all, was to have a body, an international body that will be like the Vatican Council, where the Pope will emerge. As you know, that originally the Roman Catholic Church did not have a Pope. It was the Bishop of Rome that was the head of the church. But eventually, that same person who was the Bishop of Rome for the Western Church, he became the Pope eventually, with all that surrounds what the Pope can do and not do. They were worried about that. It was so sensitive that there was a discussion about whether they can have communion together sponsored by the LW, the Lutheran World Federation itself. It was clear that that cannot be the case. So the Church of Sweden hosted the communion, inviting delegates to come as guests of Christ through the mediation of the Church of Sweden at that time. There were some who did not receive communion, who were not willing to participate and to partake of the communion. Because, as you know, as I said earlier on, there had been so much tension in Europe and North America because of the war. However, eventually, that became easier. The council is at another level that functioned as the board of directors, if I may use the language from business, that the council in the LWF functioned as a board of directors between assemblies, overseeing the implementation of the decisions that were made by the assembly. The third level is that of the communion office in Geneva, that acts as an administrative and programmatic arm, implementing the projects and facilitating communication between member churches. It's headed by the General Secretary. As I said, the president is the spiritual leader of the LWF. Mind you, the title president, it was intended that it should never be a person who is regarded as, even if they're a bishop or whatever, the president is the president. He chairs the assembly and chairs the council. Now, the core work of the LWF is theology and communion. Today, the emphasis on the core work of the LWF is theology and communion. This changes from generation to generation. The focus changes because of the needs around the world and the needs within the member churches. This includes theological reflection, pastoral formation, interfaith and ecumenical relations, and promoting unity and within diversity. The second focus is humanitarian aid and development. The third is advocacy and public witness. The fourth is capacity building and leadership development. This is what the focus is within the space in which we are of the Lutheran World Federation. There has been an emphasis on who we are. The emphasis that we are a communion of churches. What does that mean? The Constitution of the Lutheran World Federation always read in the past that the Lutheran World Federation is an association of independent churches, with the understanding that the LWF is not governing the member churches, is not bossing the member churches, but the churches are governed by their synods. However, These churches, which are governed by their synods, are in an association relationship, in an associate relationship, and they are autonomous. Now that we are a communion, much more than we are a federation, the structures, federal structures were adopted in 1947. Also to emphasize that we are independent churches as governed by our synods. At this time, the Lutheran World Federation is called a Lutheran World Federation, a communion of churches, which means there is something ecclesiological here that is moved on, that is intensified. The density of the Lutheran World Federation, the theological density or ecclesiological density, is much more than the federal structures can ever explain. So, however, what it means now is practically in the Constitution and the bylaws would say, in this relationship, we are in pulpit and altar fellowship. The Lutheran World Federation member churches agree that they are in pulpit and altar fellowship. That means a pastor in ELCSA can function as a pastor in Canada. There is no need for reordination unless there are some requirements that have to do with specific things in that church that may be asked for. It is important here that I emphasize also that it was a very difficult discussion regarding the definition of the Lutheran World Federation as a communion of churches and the implications. That has now been settled in that interpretation. However, there are still disagreements which we recognize at that time. Those who are not satisfied that our pastors we ordain only men, but other churches' ordination is open to qualified, baptized Christians who are either men or women. So in others, it was not open. The assembly in Curitiba did provide a phrase that those churches which are not able to embrace the ordination as ordination for all people who are baptized and are qualified for ordination, they should be accompanied by the member churches until they reach that stage. When we left Curitiba Assembly, there were churches that were not willing. And there was a process of accompaniment. And a lot of churches in due course embraced the pulpit and altar fellowship clause. Australia was not in a position at that time. We had to find a solution by amending the Constitution to include that there will be a space for membership that is associate membership. And those churches would be accompanied, would be supported by the Lutheran World Federation member churches until such a time that they are able to. I'm not sure whether all of them have come in now, but those who are still outside have a status that is accommodating them to always be associated with the LWF. Joint theological projects such as ecumenical dialogues. The Lutheran World Federation was now regarded by its member churches who were in full pulpit and altar fellowship with one another, that they can take over the mantle of discussing with the other church families. And the results of that conversation, dialogue, will be recognized by the member churches after consultation. A good example is that of the Joint Declaration of the Doctrine of Justification that was signed on the 31st of October 1999. It was a long process that brought us to find consensus between us and the Catholic Church, and nullified some of the anathemas around justification, the doctrine of justification. And those that are remaining are considered not heavy enough to continue dividing. They are not divisive of the church. However, they need attention nonetheless. The agenda has been set as to what to do since we have signed this document, which has now become not only a bilateral document, but a document that has been embraced by the Anglican Church, the Anglican Communion, the Reformed churches, the Methodists. And so there are 5 global church families that have accepted and endorsed the joint declaration. The other area was the mutual learning and accompaniment. What it means within the space of we are a communion of churches, although we are autonomous, but we are committed to living a relationship of solidarity with other sister churches. The accompaniment of the visitation from member churches or between member churches and among member churches has become a very important practice of the Lutheran World Federation. You'll remember, some of you, the visitation that has been done a few years ago to Jerusalem to accompany the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Jerusalem and Jordan. Prayers for one another have become very significant, and they've been given emphasis. We are committed to live a life of shared responses to global challenges. The Lutheran World Federation Secretariat, through the Council, can advocate and translate and interpret the decisions of the Council in dealing with global challenges. And those letters from the Office of the General Secretary are shared through media, the Lutheran documents, and they represent what the mind of the Lutheran World Federation member churches. The LWF facilitates also its the responsibility of facilitating and sharing human and financial and theological resources across the continents. Churches in the global north often support educational and social development in the global south, while the churches in the global south contribute spirituality, vital spirituality, and theological innovations. Examples such as from the north, support on scholarship for theological education, the support with emergency funds during floods, droughts, and conflicts, collaborative liturgical and hymn writing projects. This comes mainly from the north. The south contributes to the fellowship of the Lutheran World Federation, African Lutheran Church's reflection on Ubuntu and liberation theology. The Asians have been able to support the work of the LWF with their own experiences regarding interreligious dialogues. In Latin America, the Lutheran churches have had an experience on base community theology, which these are shared as resources and insights to the common good. Attention has been given together by the LWF and member churches on gender and youth inclusion. Since the year 1984, the LWF has introduced very strict, I believe myself, very strict procedures regarding quotas. For the LWF, 40% women, 40% men, 20% youth is the principle and procedure by which we assess decisions, common decisions that we make together. There must be 50%, 40% men present, 40% participation of women, and 20% participation of the youth. This is critical in ensuring that patriarchy does not deny women and youth the opportunity to contribute to insights in God's mission. Now, let's look at the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Southern Africa. As I said earlier, historically, ELCSA is rooted in the missionary efforts of various European Lutheran missions and the African missionaries recruited by the same European Lutheran missions to be participants in their agencies as missionaries. In my view, the mutual partnership between missionaries and African European descent, their partnership was remarkable in a way, although it did not, and still is not, it has not received the authenticity it deserves. Let me give you an example. You know, when you look into the missiological documents, you discover that agencies such as, for example, the Church of Sweden mission that worked in Zululand and Natal and other parts of South Africa here, back then, in before 1800 and something, the late 1800s, and in 1902, for example, from Dundee, they sent missionaries from the Zulu congregations. From Apelsbosch, they sent missionaries from the Zulu congregations. Reverend Kamani, Ben Kamani from Apelsbosch in 1904. Jeremiah Makubu from Dundee. They were missionaries. Makubu, who left Dundee with 2 Swedish missionaries for Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. After a few months in Zimbabwe, he was attacked by malaria and he died. And his grave is in that country. Kamani worked and he returned back to South Africa. There are many others who were recruited in that time to work in other parts of Africa. ELCSA's roots are deeply rooted in that. These mission agencies that sent missionaries, recruited missionaries, fall into ELCSA. There are other missionaries, African missionaries, that went to such countries as Zimbabwe, Zambia, but they came through other channels. In Lesotho, the Basotho missionaries to Zambia, they were recruited, however, by the sister organization that was friendly and collaborating with the Berlin Mission Society. In Lesotho, there was a training center for African missionaries who went to Zambia to work among the Lozi people, as Lozi and Sesotho language are almost close cousins. So the ELCSA was officially formed in 1975 through the union of several regional Lutheran synods who were deeply rooted and rooted in these mission societies. This union marked the culmination of many years of ecumenical and organizational negotiations. Before ELCSA was formed, there was FELCSA. FELCSA is a regional organization that brought together many Lutheran churches within the SADC region. And FELCSA was a regional organization that was the expression of the Lutheran World Federation. It came into existence on account of the encouragement of the LWF, bringing together the churches in the SADC region in order to, one, coordinate the work, hoping for the establishment of Lutheran unity in the region. Two, to resist the apartheid policies and the colonial difficulties that has to do also with Rhodesia at that time, now Zimbabwe, Namibia, and other places like Angola, Mozambique. This formation of FELCSA was important also for the birth of LUCSA. In other words, the churches from the region put back into the formation of LUCSA what they had received from ELCSA-related mission organizations that were in existence way before most of the churches here were structured as churches, but as mission agencies. ELCSA and the struggle of apartheid puts ELCSA on a very high note. ELCSA distinguished itself after its formation. It joined the LWF in 1976, and the following year, 1997, ELCSA participated through its delegation to the LWF Assembly in Dar es Salaam. It was the first meeting of the LWF on the African continent in the form of an assembly. ELCSA brought in a challenging proposal in the assembly. And that was to raise the issue of apartheid, that apartheid policies and their consequences are generating a situation that calls for status confessionis. Status confessionis is a moment for confessing. Why? Because apartheid as a political ideology was a challenge to the doctrine of creation, giving the impression and articulating that others were born superior and others were inferior. And so the feeling was that, and the theological argument was that, that is undermining the creation, the doctrine of creation. All people made in the image of God are equal. There cannot be others who are superior and others inferior. That was a fundamental heretical position of the apartheid ideology. Manase Buthelezi, who had become the bishop of the Central Diocese, raised a challenge in the assembly in Dar es Salaam in 1977. And the world supported South Africa. They supported ELCSA. Through its own bishops, like Manase Buthelezi, Bishop Serute, Dlamini, Rapo, and others, deans and others, ELCSA took the battle to the international community and churches. As I said, the Bishop Manase and others like him, they spoke prophetically against racial oppression. ELCSA aligned itself with the South African Council of Churches on this matter of advocacy. The church offered sanctuary and moral support to many activists and many communities. It became an important moral voice and earned international recognition in the LWF and LWF member churches and the ecumenical circles. Now, there were many at that time meetings that were held outside South Africa by ELCSA churches. In Botswana, gatherings were held in order to bring the difficult of churches and their proclamation of the gospel to the public. ELCSA also, during that time, difficult as it was able to allow their theological seminaries, diaconal institutes for training to be available to other churches outside South Africa. At Mpumulo, students from abroad and outside the continent, outside South Africa. At LTI, the same applied. Students from Tanzania, from Nigeria, from other parts of our independent Africa came to study in ELCSA institution. That was a great service that made ELCSA, in spite of its limited resources, they opened themselves to that. The training of pastors here made ELCSA an important accompanying church to others. We used the Lutheran World Federation at that time, asked bishops who were retired from ELCSA, such as Bishop Dlamini. We had a situation in Malawi where we had to train the pastors and send now Bishop Vumbe to the UK for studies, to Botswana for orientation, to the United States of America for further studies. During that time, it was difficult to have Bishop Vumbe, now Bishop Vumbe, to leave his office as a pastor there to go elsewhere. But it became easy because we came to ELCSA for resources. ELCSA was willing to support the retired Bishop Dlamini to work in Malawi as an interim bishop. Situation happened also in Zambia. Allowed Bishop Buthelezi, who had retired, to be an interim bishop in Zambia. But the situation of the church internally was very difficult, and he had to deal with that. ELCSA did also have its own sons and daughters elsewhere. Professor Sibusiso Pengu, who worked at the Lutheran World Federation as a researcher, for the global churches and the northern churches as well. He served them in that capacity as a researcher, bringing forward the situation of economic difficulties in the Southern Hemisphere. He died, he passed on recently, and I think most people remember him also as a very careful, articulate son of the church here in ELCSA. We had others like Professor Maimela, as I said earlier, who took the battle after Dr. Manasi Buthelezi as bishop. He was sitting in the LWF Department of Theology and Studies, where he continued to articulate, to make a contribution from this church and from Africa as a whole, as a representative and a vice chair of that committee and department. With others, if I mention names, if I don't mention everybody's name, we had Farisani, the son of this church in the north, who went through a very difficult moment through the apartheid government. And he was a person who everybody knew exactly what was happening to him. And he articulated the situation of apartheid in South Africa, and ELCSA became a voice also of the world. We had many others, men and women, who were members of the council, who sat and articulated and worked with all of us, giving profile of the work of ELCSA. Bishop Rakuba, being the first General Secretary of ACT International. ACT International was a body brought together by the Lutheran World Federation. I was a signatory of that in the formation of it, and Conrad Reiser, General Secretary of the World Council of Churches. The two of us brought this into existence and called somebody to come and head it. It was responsible, and it still is responsible, for international aid for needy areas of the world from an ecumenical point of view. He was the first to take that. I'm raising these names, and others have gone as missionaries to places like Lesotho. And the formation of ELCB whatever difficult circumstances it was at that time. But the question is that church is out of the work of ELCSA, the theological seminary at Marang. Most of those people were trained there, as Bishop Robinson and others. Sisters and brothers, with ELCSA being what it has been, we also know that it is important for ELCSA in its difficulties as it is today economically to continue to pioneer the work. I think there are areas that ELCSA can do more together with other Lutheran churches here within the space of LUCSA, which is the successor to FELCSA. FELCSA was replaced by LUCSA after the Lutheran World Federation asked me to proceed to find a solution because FELCSA was no longer functional in terms of being an regional national committee of the LWF because it is broken into two pieces. ELCSA had stood up to say LUCSA does not function, FELCSA does not function anymore as an effective organization. So we ended up in Geneva receiving delegation from FELCSA and some other delegation from ELCSA. It became difficult to manage the division between the two. And yet we had worked for it to be one institution, to work together as a national committee. So at the end, we had to dissolve FELCSA as a friendly act, not an enemy act, friendly decision to bring back that dynamic organization which FELCSA was, and we created and formed LUCSA. LUCSA was the first ever regional body to be called the Lutheran Communion in Southern Africa, or communion. The word communion, for regional bodies, it was LUCSA that was the first one to be launched under that umbrella name. So, with working with LUCSA, working with other churches, I think with other Lutheran churches here in the region, the reason for emphasizing ELCSA today is because that is how the theme is. The role of FELCSA, of LUCSA, of ELCSA in the Lutheran World Federation and in the wider Lutheran family of churches. They can be to rethink again about theological education. As the case is on now, as I understand, I've seen that. But I think we need to galvanize a united front in terms of theological training, as the case was in the past, offering that ELCSA made for its centers to be centers of training for all churches. Today, we can still put together our strength and not to train in isolation and in silo. That is not what Lutherans are known to be doing. To be Lutheran is to be ecumenical. But also to be ecumenical is also to be Lutheran. I would urge and appeal that we do organize our theological training to manage the resources which we have and don't have. It will also be important that for ELCSA and in the sister churches in the region, we have never in our history have had so many educated people, masters of theology, doctors of theology, professors And yet, we still don't have where we gather and articulate and show that we are the theologians of the church. So I think it would be wise and helpful to go for a formation of committees of theologians of the church to assist the church, to articulate from behalf of the church, and assist, as I said, the church in its work as it faces the challenging times. Also, the third thing I think is important is not to forget to articulate and speak to the public. We need to address issues that are facing the church today. We need to assist the Episcopal Council in its work by deepening and reflecting on the theological and traditions of the Lutheran World Federation and the Lutheran churches in Africa. Secondly, and lastly, I think we need to support the work of ecumenical dialogues. The Lutheran World Federation and the Lutheran churches, and represented by the church, by the delegates from South Africa, Manas Buthelezi among them, Bishop Biela, and as I understand, also participating in some of these international meetings, is the ED of ELCSA, who herself is a theologian and a pastor. We need, as I think, to support the work of dialogue. We have been leading in the LWF has been leading in the ecumenical conversation and dialogues. There is a possibility today that we can continue to do so from Southern Africa. The agenda is clear, what remains to be addressed. And on that, I would like to say, Bishop Nyaka and the leadership of ELCSA at all levels, the space and the time is possible. We have educated men and women who can provide the resources. I thank you.